Hi, this is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe, your host today for American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who represent America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump. Our guest today is the former U.S. Ambassador to India, Kenneth Juster, who served from 2017 to January of 2021. He previously was Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Affairs and Undersecretary of Commerce, where he co-founded the U.S.-India High Technology Cooperation Group. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
India is often in the news, but it's particularly in the news now because of the terrible problems they're having with the COVID virus. Lots of countries are having problems, but it seems as though India is having more problems than most. Could you roll us back to the beginning of the crisis in India and while you were there and your perspectives on what's going on in India with the crisis?
Sure. Let me try to give a brief overview, and I really break it down into two phases. In March of 2020, when the COVID pandemic was beginning, India went under a severe lockdown, I think as severe as any in the world. It did this in part because its whole healthcare infrastructure is underdeveloped, and they were afraid of being overwhelmed with people that would come down with the COVID symptoms. And so during the 6 weeks of the severe lockdown, they were really able to build up supplies of ventilators, of protective equipment, and of pharmaceuticals to help treat people who would come down with COVID. Now, there were some very negative impacts of the lockdown in terms of its devastation of the economy and of the migrant workers who contribute to that economy, but it did enable the country to get ahead to a certain degree of the COVID virus. And you saw throughout this period of 2020, there were a lot of cases, and India, I believe, was third behind the United States and Brazil in terms of total number of cases. The fatality rate was surprisingly low, and the country was able to manage to a certain degree. There are different speculations as to how the fatality rate was so low. In part, India has a very young population, about 65% of the people are under the age of 35. You had the summer in India where people are outside a great deal. So despite the fact that it's a very dense country, you were not indoors. And people in India had been exposed to the SARS virus in 2003 and to a lot of other illnesses. And so there was a sense maybe that there was a enhanced immune system. There had been a lot of people. And by the time I left India, the number of cases was really on the decline overall, and it had been managed reasonably well, despite, though, the very negative impact of the lockdown on the economy, which contracted more than any major economy in the world and has its own negative collateral consequences for people, their mental health and welfare.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
On the lockdown, you said it was a 6-week lockdown. Did I understand?
Well, it actually went on for several phases. The initial phase was 3 weeks, but I mean, you could not, the streets were barren. There were no people out. We operated the embassy. You had to get special passes for individuals to go there. So we maybe had about 10% of people there.
Until about when?
Well, it was then extended for several weeks and then gradually continued to be extended for a few months, but at increasingly liberal exceptions for what could be done. I mean, we had severe issues at the outset about how businesses that were critical to the United States infrastructure, the financial sector, the medical sector, and the like, could operate their back rooms in India, and whether those were essential operations. We had to move medical supplies. India's a critical component of the international pharmaceutical system. More than half the world's vaccines are made in India. We do a tremendous amount of health cooperation, but it was really a deep and severe lockdown. And as I said, you were not out on the roads, and it was really barren. Now, we did at the time have our special representative for Afghanistan had to fly in. I went out to the airport to greet him. The place was seen out of the twilight zone. There's just simply nobody there. So it was very severe, but it also had a major impact. You have migrant workers who live on a subsistence level, and they suddenly were without income and not even near their villages, and how should that be managed? So there are a lot of complications with the lockdown that I think had some impact in this next phase, where the country's been less eager to have any sort of lockdown that could again cripple the economy in the country in other ways. But by February, March of this year, things were looking pretty good in India, and it was sort of a success story. And I think at that point, they let their guard down to a certain degree. India, while it is the major producer of vaccines,
Right.
had really not ordered externally vaccines for its own country and was exporting 65 million vaccines to other countries around the world, I believe over 85 countries, and has only vaccinated about 3% of its own population. And it's a very dense country. It's got a geography about a third the size of the United States, but over 4 times the number of people, 1.4 million people. So it's the type of situation where if COVID starts to get out of control, it can spread rapidly. So you had not a vaccinated population. Then you had political rallies. There were state elections in 4 states, and then election also in a union territory. And there were dozens of political rallies the prime minister and others attended with no masks. People were really letting their guard down, a lot of density. And these led to super spreader events. You also had a major Hindu pilgrimage event called the Kumbh Mela that normally is in 2022 in a place called Haridwar. It was moved up to 2021. Millions of people coming together in this village, again, a super spreader event. And you had a healthcare system that they had worked hard to compensate for in March and April and May of last year. But again, the guard had been left down and they really are not equipped to deal with cases. And suddenly it was a perfect storm with the healthcare system simply overwhelmed and people can't even get in a bed in the major cities. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question about that, which relates to the politics of India. I knew they were a big producer of vaccines. How politically can a government in a democratic country be exporting vaccines when they're not vaccinating their own people? That seems hard to get your head around. So explain to me what's in the culture of politics in India that allowed that to happen.
Well, a couple of things. First, they do feel an obligation to other neighboring countries and other countries around the world. That's part of their own sort of internal philosophy. 2, again, the cases were sort of on the downward trend in India. And 3, there's the prime minister is certainly suffering a lot of criticism for that now. There is not a very strong opposition at the national level to the prime minister. And in fact, during the COVID crisis, despite having a border standoff with the Chinese in the north, despite having a devastated economy, and despite having a COVID situation, the prime minister's approval ratings went up. As I said, a little luster has been taken off with the most recent situation, and now people are complaining, how could you have so mismanaged the vaccination area? Now, to vaccinate 1.4 billion people is not easy under any circumstances, and now you have many countries, over 50 countries, sending ingredients to the United States to send vaccine and ingredients to India, sending protective equipment, sending other types of medical supplies, but it's not going to slow down the current process and is very tough on their medical infrastructure to get these things circulated around. You have a situation where in the last couple of weeks, it seems to have potentially peaked out in the major cities. At one point, there were over 400,000 cases a day. Now it's around to about 200,000. But people feel the numbers are vastly underreported, maybe 2 to 5 times. This is in part because in rural areas, you don't pick up the numbers. And to the degree that the virus really spreads now to the rural parts of India, it's going to be very difficult to deal with because the health infrastructure there is very poor. And what's of great concern is that these new variants have developed, including what's called a double mutant, which seem to be more contagious, especially among younger people. So you now have people in India under the age of 40 that were not catching COVID, catching it, and perhaps it's more deadly as well. And of course, this spreads to the rest of us. So it's a serious concern right now.
It sounds like at this point in the late spring, early summer of 2021, it's not clear how this turns out well in India. I mean, it sounds like the worst is yet to come. Is that a fair description?
We don't know if the worst is yet to come or if the worst has occurred and it will start to get better, especially as the hot weather comes about. But this has been, some people say, the worst crisis India has had since its founding, when there was the partition of India and Pakistan, and millions of people were killed as they moved across borders from one country to the other. It certainly is devastating. There will be deaths well beyond what we may even get in the count, because again, in the rural area, people die without there being a count of that. And it's a huge crisis, and it's a very sad situation to see it. Almost everyone, myself included, know people who have died of this dreadful virus.
Wow. Well, thank you for that frank description of what's going on in India. And I know everyone's going to be following it for months and months to come, and hope they can get this under control, as other countries and we are. Let me switch topics.
Sure.
A little about the change in administration is in the United States is in a lot of ways, I would say both former President Trump and current President Biden postured the choice in the election as being pretty dramatic. And there have been some significant changes in just different areas. But I'd be interested in your take on how that has affected and how that plays out in the U.S.-India relationship.
Well, thank you for that question, Jim. And there are parts of the world, I think especially Europe, where there's an emphasis on how different the Biden administration foreign policy may be from the Trump administration's policy. But I would contend that India is an area of great continuity, and there's been a very solid handoff in the bilateral relationship. You really step back, the U.S.-India relationship really started to be transformed at the very end of the Clinton administration. Historically, India was the leader of the non-aligned movement and then had sided more with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, in part because the United States had tilted toward Pakistan, and India got its weaponry from the Soviets and later now from the Russians. But it's always been democracy, and the world's largest democracy. We are the world's oldest democracy. And there was a sense, especially after, as you may recall, Y2K, when Indian tech companies were helpful to the United States, and there's an increasing growing number of Indian Americans, there's now 4 million in our country, that there should be better relations between the two countries. And in 1998, India undertook some nuclear tests, and that led to a bunch of sanctions against them. But Clinton was always fascinated by India and traveled to India at the end of his term, which started to put a thaw in the relationship, but there was still the nuclear issue to overcome. And President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Vajpayee of India really felt the relationship should be transformed. And that has started to take place in 2001 when I was undersecretary, and you mentioned the High Technology Cooperation Group, in which India wanted greater access to sensitive U.S. technology, and we laid out some roadmaps for how to do that in ways that were mutually beneficial. And ultimately, that led to what was known as the Civil Nuclear Deal in 2005. But the relationship has continued to grow. India is not an ally. It's not an adversary. It's an increasingly important strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific region. And through changes in administration and also from party to party in both countries, there's been a strong consensus of the importance of this relationship, and each administration has built on the successes of its predecessors. And we're already seeing that with the Biden administration. One of the concepts that really solidified during the Trump administration was the notion of an Indo-Pacific region, which is increasingly, I think, the center of international gravity for international affairs, with the countries with the largest populations, the largest economies, the fastest growth rate of economies, major portion of international trade, significant natural resources. You have to deal with the rise of China. And the U.S.-India relationship is going to be a key pillar of stability in this region. And so while it had previously been thought of as the Asia-Pacific, making the Indo-Pacific and the connections between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean was a critical concept, but it was not clear that this would be part of the Biden administration. They've embraced it. They've created an Indo-Pacific coordinator at the NSC with an experienced hand in charge. We also began and resurrected a quadrilateral group of countries, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. It had originally come into being in 2004 in response to a tsunami that had occurred in the region, but it sort of fell out of favor 2007, in part to Chinese pressure. But we worked hard to resurrect that in 2017. We ultimately had 2 ministerials in 2019 and 20, including an in-person meeting of ministers in October 2020, despite COVID. And now President Biden has further elevated it with a virtual summit meeting in March of this year, and the desire to have in-person meetings later this year, and an effort for this group to work on vaccine issues, on technology issues, cybersecurity, climate issues. It is not viewed as a military grouping. The Indians don't want to antagonize the Chinese, but there's increasing coordination in maritime security and the like. And there'll be continuity on economic issues, an effort to try to enhance and continue to grow U.S. trade and investment with India. You'll see it in our health cooperation. That was a big element of what we've done. We had 34 people from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention at the embassy in New Delhi, and we worked closely on a whole range of health issues, including the development and production of vaccines and other assistance during the COVID pandemic. Energy has been an area of growth and development where the United States is now a major energy supplier. We'll work with India on climate issues. So it's a relationship that covers really every issue out there, and they're all in play because, as I said, it's not an ally or an adversary, but there's a consensus about the importance of the relationship. And I've worked already with my counterparts in the U.S. government. There's not yet a new U.S. ambassador named. Right. There are rumors about that, but with the people in the administration, and it really is an issue, in my opinion, of continuity and continued building on the successes of each previous administration.
That's very, very interesting and good. Good. Glad to hear that. I want to switch over to one last topic.
Sure.
You said several times that India is not an ally or an adversary, and you've touched on China. You haven't touched on Russia, but I think today most people see Russia and China, as we have actually off and on over many decades, as sort of major geostrategic, at minimum, competitors and periodically adversaries. Where does India fit into that? It's obviously the largest country in the world. It's geographically bordering China and Russia and all that. So where does India fit into sort of the geopolitical?
That's a great question. You know, India has a very different geographical and historical position than the United States. They've dealt with China for thousands of years. They're both civilizational powers. They border each other. In the past, they worked together, but they had a war in 1962. They'd never delineated their border clearly. They've sort of compartmentalized that issue and were able to cooperate in other areas, including economic trade and investment. But in recent years, that's become more challenging. The Indians have been very concerned about China's Belt and Road Initiative, in which China invests in other countries, in part because the flagship project is what's called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that actually goes through territory that India claims as its own.
Which territory is that? Which territory is that?
This is up in the northern part of India, in what is a disputed area of Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir. Gotcha. that India says is its territory. Pakistan says it's its own territory. Pakistan then ceded part of that to China, right. And this corridor will go through that. But this area now is where China suddenly in 2020 amassed 50,000 troops on the border with India and actually entered contested area. And there's been a military standoff. They've disengaged, but not de-escalated to any great degree. And that's a real worrisome situation. And it really has shattered the trust that India had with China. The prime minister had been holding informal summits every year with President Xi, but the situation is at a whole different level of perspective. Now, the Indians also, as I mentioned, have had a historical relationship with the Soviet Union and Russia as a arms supplier, and India is very reluctant to damage that relationship because of their concern that Russia might team up with China. And they were already dealing with China and China's close ally, Pakistan, which is on India's western border and is a challenge too. And people sometimes don't realize that with China, India, and Pakistan, you have 3 nuclear armed states, all with contentious situations. So it's in a very delicate position, but as I said, India has continually enhanced its strategic partnership with the United States. It still believes in the concept of strategic autonomy, that it's not an ally and it will operate independently and make its own decisions. But the Chinese actions are pushing India increasingly, I think, closer to the other democracies in the region, the United States, Australia, Japan, to help preserve the open and free Indo-Pacific region. And the principles that the leaders of these countries, the Quad countries, have enunciated are the importance of territorial integrity, of freedom of navigation and overflight and commerce, of the settlement, peaceful settlement of disputes in courts of international law, and the not having economic coercion. So while the Chinese effort may have been to try to intimidate the Indians and say, don't get too close to the United States, don't keep building the strategic partnership, in a sense, it has had just the opposite effect, where India is working more closely with us and with this Quad group of countries.
Let me ask you one follow-up question on that,
Sure.
which is, a lot of people in the United States spend a lot of time thinking about, what does China want? Where is China going? What is trying to do? There's debate about it, and that's understandable and appropriate. As someone who is not an expert on the Indo-Pacific region at all, I can see why China would want to intimidate small countries. I can't really understand why China would want to intimidate India. I mean, from every point of view, India, geographically, population-wise, economically, militarily, is on the landmass their biggest, most powerful neighbor. Why do they want to get in a fight with them?
Well, I ultimately don't think the Chinese want to get in a fight. What they want to do is intimidate the Indians and others in the region without getting in a fight. But the Indians have adjusted their posture and have pushed back in ways that the Chinese might not have anticipated. But the Chinese behavior of the last few years has surprised a lot of us. And whether this is due to President Xi and his own vision of where China is going, whether it's a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis and the sense in China that the Western world is on the way down and China is ascending, whether it was due to the way the Chinese were able to manage the COVID situation better than other countries. All of this has made the Chinese increasingly aggressive in their posture. And we've seen it in the South China Sea with the countries of Southeast Asia. We've seen it in the East China Sea with Japan. We've seen it with India on its borders. We've seen it with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with trying to claim territory of Bhutan. And it is hard to have any clear explanation other than the fact that the Chinese feel that this is their century and their opportunity to once again assert the dominance in the region and even more globally of China's place in the world. And as I said, it may also be to send a message to India: we don't want you working with the United States and others to try to encircle and contain us. And in that sense, it's had a backfire. But this is going to be one of the great areas of challenge. And the idea of the Quad and of other groupings in the region is to build a web of connections and practices and countries that will push back, not in a way that engenders a conflict, hopefully, but in a way that makes it clear that this is the way we want this region to operate, and we're not going to let one country dominate it or intimidate others.
Ambassador Juster, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much, Jim. Thank you.
This is Ambassador Jim Rosapepe for American Ambassadors Live Podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to American Ambassadors Live Podcast and leave us a review. And tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.